Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Nancy and in today's class we're going to be learning how to make this over bust asymmetric blouse. So in our previous tutorial I showed you how to draft this over bust asymmetric blouse. So if you're interested in learning how I drafted this blouse, I'll be dropping the link to the tutorial in the description box. So I've transferred the pattern for my front pieces on my actual fabric. So let's start with F1. On this side, I added half of an inch stitching allowance. At the top here, I added half of an inch stitching allowance and at the bottom as well. Now for the side, I added just 1 inch stitching allowance. So now you need to make sure that both the actual fabric and lining is cut as a single piece. And I also placed an ST at the wrong side of both the lining and the actual fabric. Now for F2, I added half of an inch stitching allowance to all the sides and the bottom as well. So I've also cut out a single piece for the F2, and this time around I'm going to be using the actual fabric as my lining because this F2 is going to be at the center front of the blouse where the eyelet is going to be fixed. And I also went ahead to place an ST on the wrong side of the fabric. Now for the F3, I'm going to be adding 1 inch stitching allowance on both sides. And for the top and bottom, I'll just be adding half of an inch stitching allowance. I've gone ahead to cut out a single piece and I'm also going to be using the actual fabric as the lining just like we did for the F2 because we'd also be fixing some eyelets on this part. Now for the F4, I've gone ahead to cut a single piece of the actual fabric. On this side, I added half of an inch stitching allowance. At the top and bottom, I added half of an inch. And at the side, I added just 1 inch. And I also went ahead to cut out a single piece for the lining as well. And then I placed an ST on the wrong side of both fabrics. Now I'm going to place the front pattern this way to take out the pattern for both the F1 and F2. Now I'm going to pick the actual fabric for F1 and F2 to place them on each other, right side to right side facing each other. So I'm going to be joining them together with my pin. I'll head over to the sewing machine to stitch by half of an inch following the direction of my finger. So after stitching the actual fabric, I'm also going to pick the lining for both the F1 and F2 to place the right sides on each other and to stitch the bust area by half of an inch as well. So after stitching, this is how it should be. So now you're going to use your scissors to notch the stitching allowance. That's the same allowance on the sides, and then you'd also do the same on the lining as well. So for now, that will be all for the F1 and F2. So now let's focus on stitching both F3 and F2 together. So I'm going to unpin the pattern and then I'll take the actual fabric of both the F3 and F2 to place them right side to right side facing each other, and I'll head over to my sewing machine to stitch the sides by half of an inch after pinning the sides together. So I'm going to stitch the sides by half of an inch following the direction of my finger, and I'll also repeat the same stitching process for the lining. After stitching, this is how it should be. Now I'll go ahead to notch the seam allowance. So after I've done that, I turned the fabric to the right side and I noticed that there was an extra pieces at the bottom here. So I'm going to cut it out. I'm going to trim it out so that it aligns properly. So that's basically it. So these are all the front pieces and these are the linings for the front pieces as well. So let's keep this aside so we can focus on the back pieces for now. So these are the back pieces. For the B1, I added half of an inch stitching allowance to the top, to the bottom and to this side. Now for this other side, I added 1 inch. Now for the center here, I added half of an inch stitching allowance all around. Now for B3, I added half of an inch stitching allowance to the top, the bottom and this side. While for this other side, I added just 1 inch stitching allowance. So now for B1, I've cut out just a single piece of the actual fabric and the lining as well. I did the same for B2 and B3. And I also made sure that I placed an ST on the wrong side of both the lining and the actual fabric. First of all, I'll take out the pattern for B2 and then I'll take out the lining. So now I'm going to fold the center of the actual fabric into two to make it that at the center, and this is because the human back isn't straight, it's a little bit curvy at the back. So what I'm going to do now is to mark the dot. So I'm going to place my tape measure from the top here to mark the midpoint. And then from this midpoint, I'm going to mark half of an inch from the center here. Now I'm going to mark 1 inch at the top and 1 inch at the bottom to connect the 3 points together. I would head over to the sewing machine to stitch directly on the chalk, and then I would repeat the same stitching process on the lining as well. After stitching, this is how it should be, and this is how the lining should be as well. So once this is done, the next thing I'm going to do is to place the actual fabric of B1 directly on the center here to stitch the sides together by half of an inch, following the direction of my finger. After stitching this side, you would spread it out this way to place B3 on this side, and then also stitch by half of an inch, and make sure you do exactly the same thing for the lining. After stitching the back pieces together, this is how it should be. Now you go ahead to notch the seams just like you see me doing. So make sure you do exactly the same thing on the lining as well. Now once you are done with that, we have our back pieces ready and the front pieces is also ready. So what I'm going to do now is to pick the actual fabric for both the front piece and the back piece. So this is the back piece here. I'm going to place the front piece directly on the back pieces just like you see me doing to pin the sides together. And now I'm going to place the other side of the front piece on this side as well to pin the sides together. So after pinning the sides together, the next thing I did was to trim out the edges of the excess fabric at the top and bottom. And after this, I would head over to the sewing machine to stitch the sides by 1 inch. After stitching, I'm going to specifically notch the seam allowance around the waist, so please take note of that. So now I'm going to turn the blouse to the right side of the fabric so you see the way it is. Here you'll be able to identify that this is the bust area and this is the second bust area on the side. So now I'm going to repeat the same stitching processes on the lining as well. So guys, I've gone ahead to stitch the lining. Now I'm going to place the right side of the lining directly on the right side of the actual fabric to pin the edges together. After pinning the edges, I would start by stitching from the bottom here, half of an inch, following the direction of my finger, and I will keep stitching. So now when I get to this top, I'm going to make a straight stitch at the top here to continue stitching all the way down. You would see what I'm trying to explain by the time I'm done stitching. So guys, I've stitched the edges and you can see how the stitching is at the top here and then at the sides as well. What I'm going to do next is to turn the blouse to the right side of the fabric just like you see me doing. So once you've turned the fabric to the right side, you're going to head over to the ironing board to iron the blouse properly. So I've done that here already, and this is how the shape of the blouse should be. You can see that it's actually looking exactly the same way it is on the style inspiration. So now the next step is on how to insert the boning into the blouse. So you can see that I've spread out the blouse, and on this side of the blouse, that's the asymmetric part where you have the joining by the side. I'm going to start stitching at the top here, top of the edges, half of an inch away from the edges, and on this sharp edge I'm going to measure half of an inch away so that it will be accurate, and then I'll keep stitching all the way down to the end of the blouse. So the essence of creating this stitching is to create a casing in which the boning will be inserted into. On this side at the top here, I'll stitch half of an inch away from the edges as well. So the boning I'm using is just quarter of an inch so that it can easily pass into the casing. So I'm going to melt the top of the boning. So to make sure that the boning relaxes properly, you'd insert the boning from the right part of the boning. That is the side of the boning that isn't curved inward. And then I'll go ahead to insert the boning into the casing I just made. So I'm going to insert it in between the actual fabric and the lining. So this is me trying to insert the boning into the casing on this part of the edges. Now I'm going to also melt the end of the boning on this side. So once you are done with that, you're going to secure the end of the boning by stitching directly on this top part. Now I'm going to be inserting a boning into the casing on this side as well. So I'm going to start by melting the top of the boning, And then remember how I told you to insert the boning? You can see the shape. You insert it into the casing like I've done here. After inserting the boning, I'm going to cut out the excess boning at the bottom and also make sure that the boning is about half of an inch away from the bottom, so that when I attach the bias tape, it would be properly sewn. Alright, so this is basically it. Now on this side as well, I'm going to melt the top of the boning here to insert the boning into the casing all the way to the top. So guys, I'm going to cut out the excess boning at the bottom as well, and then I would make sure that it's half of an inch away from the bottom of the actual fabric. Once you are done with this, the next thing you need to do is to secure the hem of the blouse using a bias tape. So I'll show you guys how to go about it. So this is my bias tape. I'm going to spread it out this way at the top, and then I'll fold the edges inward by half of an inch to insert the hem of the blouse into the bias tape. And I'll head over to my sewing machine to stitch the bias tape. So the way I folded the bias tape here is the same way you should fold it at the other end. So after stitching, this is how it should be. You can see how neat the blouse is on the inside and on the outer part as well. Now the final thing we are going to do is to mark the points we want to fix the eyelet. So make sure you arrange your blouse properly first. So to fix the eyelets, I want the eyelets to be 1 inch away from the edges. Now from the bottom here, I'm going to mark 2 inches. So from this point, I'll keep marking 2 inches intervals. So this is the point where I'm supposed to stop marking the 2 inches because it aligns with the other side. So because I want to do exactly the same thing that is on the style I'm recreating, I'll be adding extra two eyelets to the top here. So that's basically it. Now the next thing I'm going to do is to mark the point I want the highlight to be on this other side using the first side as a reference or a guide, so you can see what I'm doing, making sure that the point aligns. And this is the final point here. Now on this other side of the blouse at the bottom, they added extra two eyelets as well, so I'm marking 2 inches intervals, and I would head over to fix my eyelets. So I'm done fixing the eyelet, and you can see how it is on the inside and at the outer part as well. Now the final step is to use the bias tape to make a strip. So I'm gonna here to fold my bias tape into two, and this is how it is. Thank you for watching, and see you in my next tutorial.